are live. Welcome everybody with this first Impraise webinar about leadership. We are here in New York at a WeWork building. The WeWork crew asked us not to reveal the exact location. Security wasn't sure if they could handle the enormous fan base of our special guest of today. We have here Meredith Haberveld. Meredith is the founder, CEO of Think Human, organization that works with companies like Spotify, Betterment, and SoulCycle, help them develop leadership across the organization. Do I say that correct?
Exactly right. That's what we do. We work on executive team performance and leadership throughout all the dimensions of the organization.
And you do that on an ongoing basis, or is it like temporary consultancy project?
It really depends on the circumstance. There are times that we're brought in to lead a very defined, let's call it 5 or 6 month leadership development program, and other times that we're really deeply involved with the executive team over many years working on their culture.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much again for being here. My name is Wiebe, by the way. I'm heading the US operations for Impraise, and I'm your host for this webinar today. So in that role, let me give you a quick overview of the agenda of today. What are we going to cover today? We're going to discuss about the big challenge that HR professionals face today. How are you going to make managers good coaches? And how are they going to become the next new leaders in your organization? And maybe to start off with, why is this so important? 2 very important facts. No alternative facts, real facts here. First of all, Gallup presented that 50% of the employees leaving a company has to do with their manager, whether it's a lack of coaching, structure. And then the other important fact is that by 2020, this is only in 3 years, 50% of the workforce will be millennials. And Deloitte showed a report that 63% of those millennials feel that they lack the leadership skills. They have not yet developed enough their leadership skills. So I think hopefully that's solved tomorrow after this webinar. We're going to discuss it, how to identify those next leaders, how to train them, what are those criteria, those skills that need to be trained, and how do communication styles impact this. Having said all this, let's get started, Meredith, because I can't wait to hear all your learnings, insights, observations,
Yes,
experiences, everything. To start off, taking into consideration that 2/3 of millennials expect from their managers that they coach them, that they develop them, what is the difference between an ordinary manager and a real coach?
Well, I think for inexperienced managers coming into that role, big shift is going from being an individual contributor where your success is all about your own performance, and for those inexperienced managers to refocus from their own results and their own success, focused on supporting the team to be successful. And it's a real paradigm shift, and it's not conceptual, it's experiential. Like, you really have to reorient yourself around what to put your attention on and what the definition of success is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what kind of environment is important to create to enable that?
That is a great question. I think that Amy Edmondson and Google have certainly done a great job in the last couple of years really highlighting this soil of psychological safety that's needed for teams to really thrive, and young managers, to the original point of what do inexperienced managers not have, oftentimes they don't even have the context that that's something that they have to have their attention on developing within their team.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Amy Edmondson of psychological safety. I've worked before at Google for a few years, and that was a big thing, which I always admired a lot, the focus on creating psychological safety. Maybe also for the viewers at today's webinar, how would you describe psychological safety?
All right, well, first I'll describe it like an experience of not having it, because I think probably most of us can relate to it, and then I'll give you a formal description. But I don't know about you if you ever had this experience, but I certainly have, of working with, whether it's a boss or a colleague, where when the phone rings, you see it's them, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, like brace for like what's coming. Or you see an email from them come up on your screen, and immediately, even before you can see the subject line or the content, you're like, oh, what is it gonna be? Like the physical sensation before even the mental one of like, let me be prepared to paddle as fast as I can to explain the thing that they're upset about, or to defend myself, or to defend my team. So let's call that common experience. Have you ever had that, by the way, with a
I have it with all my emails. So I'm not...
All right, well, let's talk about that later. That's gonna be a side conversation, an important one. That is the thing that managers want to be having their eye on, not only inside, not only from their own behavior, but also creating an environment of the team where nobody has that within.
And how do you do that? How do you create that environment where people feel?
It's a great question, and there are a few critical things. One, before I give these examples, remind me that I didn't say this yet, but I just want to back up also to add in terms of the description of psychological safety, that it's not just that people not walk around afraid, but that people even be comfortable enough to take a risk with one another, and that nobody is concerned that they're going to be rejected or shamed or embarrassed inside the group if they show vulnerability or take a risk, and ultimately what you really want is for people to feel comfortable to speak up, to share an unpopular idea, to challenge a manager, so or a peer, and to do it in a way that's safe for everybody. So now back to your question about how do you create that. I think there are three really critical things that managers can focus on. Number one is your own emotional control. Managing your own anxiety and your own emotional reactions to things. So that's first and foremost. Secondly is interrupting politics and BS, especially for inexperienced managers, although I will say I say this across the board, and you may also. But you have to have the confidence and the backbone to step in when there's politics or BS going on, to step in and interrupt it and say, no pass, that's not going to happen here. And the third is to use mistakes as an opportunity for learning rather than an opportunity for blame. So you don't create a CYA culture, but instead a learning environment. And the best way young managers can do that is by sharing their own mistakes and what they learned from them.
It's interesting. We're going to talk later about communication styles and the impact of that. But when you share this, I actually have to think about, I'm Dutch, as you can hear from my accent, and we known to have a very direct, very blunt communication style. You could also call it transparent, and I think that's one of the advantages. There are a lot of disadvantages of being Dutch, but I think it helps to create a environment where we just be very open about also our mistakes. And I think I've experienced myself how really people appreciate that. So maybe our first learning is we should all go Dutch.
Yes, power to the Dutch.
Power to the Dutch. Great. So we talked about kind of this creating this psychological safety. Now, when that's there, how can actually managers do to make the difference again between that ordinary manager of a real coach? How can they show that leadership example?
To create psychological safety? Or what? Sorry, say the question.
Yeah, exactly. To create that psychological safety, what else can managers do there really different from the ordinary manager? And what I actually would like to share also before we go there, so I'll give you a minute to think about that one. What we'd like to do is also to make this a very practical webinar. We're gonna have here and there some materials or interactive poll to share. And on the topic of psychological safety, we would like to share a link with you where you can find more information about it and kind of a checklist of how to create psychological safety in your organization. So what we're going to do, we have pasted a link in the live chat where you can find an article about psychological safety.
Back to your question.
Did you have enough time for that? Yeah,
I think I get it.
Great.
So difference between great coaches and the ordinary manager. Yeah, I would say I'm interested to hear your thoughts too, but I would say the big differences I see are that great coaches have their attention on supporting the team rather than directing the team. And there's been some research really interestingly when interviewed, when an organization highlights who are their great managers, and then they interview those managers, even the verbal tendencies of the great managers, they tended to say, well, how I like to support my team, or when I'm supporting my team, they actually use the expression that their role is to support their team versus my team, and I lead my team by doing X, Y, and Z. So one is the focus on support, being in support, and only stepping out in front in times of uncertainty or instability, and knowing the nuance and the difference. So that's one. And
well, if I can maybe interrupt on this one, what I always find interesting, you say like focus on the supporting teams versus leading the teams, but at the same time, if there's one famous thing that I always keep in mind is lead by example. So where's the difference between leading or supporting, or can you support by leading? If you see the question.
Yeah, in my view, getting in the trenches, rolling up your sleeves, and working shoulder to shoulder with your team is leading by example. Yeah, I think that is an example of leading by example and supporting the team. So I would say that type of leadership is exactly the kind of support that I'm talking about.
And you have worked at various companies. Do you have examples where you have exemplary examples of that behavior? You've seen leaders?
Absolutely, on both ends of the spectrum, by the way. I think one of my more favorite examples of a service-oriented leader is the founders of SoulCycle, Julie Rice and Elizabeth Cutler. And there were times as that business was, as they were still involved in business for the whole first decade of the business, where the business is already approaching $1 billion business, and there would be a flood in the basement of a studio, and Elizabeth Cutler is in her sweatpants with a bucket, with shoulder to shoulder with everybody else.
Repairing the bikes.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and the water out of the basement at 11 at night, working side by side with people. And if you really want to embed a culture of service-oriented leaders, the most senior leadership embodying it and then rewarding it among throughout the organization is really, I think, what gets that embedded as expected organizational behavior.
Yeah, makes sense. And so there's this thing where we just discussed. It's the mindset of really supporting the team first. And for me, we can actually stop the webinar right now. It's enough learning. I'm going to take this home. I'm going to put my supporting team first. But we have some very seasoned HR professionals here, so we're gonna
Can I add one other thing about supporting versus leading?
Yeah.
Focus on acting like a farmer and developing people as a critical part of your function, and that instead of using your people to deliver on projects, using the projects to develop your people.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. To enable them, to empower them through those.
Exactly, and you really, with that context shift, you end up delivering on both the projects and elevating the bar with people over time and deepening the trust and capabilities of the entire team.
Makes a lot of sense. And so the question where I want to go is that we have mindset shift. Do you have some other concrete skills that managers, what are the most important skills that career managers maybe lack? And we would love to also check in with the poll, but what are your core skills that current managers often lack to really be a good coach?
Well, I'm dying to see what people have to say. That's far more interesting to me than my own experience and opinion. But I would say the ability to give and receive feedback effectively, oftentimes weak among managers, experienced and not. Coaching skills, which I would say is really distinct from feedback, and setting clear expectations and creating a culture of accountability where people feel grounded and safe, that they understand what's expected of themselves and each other.
Yeah, I would love to ask you a little bit more about this. Maybe in the meantime, what we can do is we're going to share a poll. So in the live chat, you see a question where poll, because we would love to understand from you, what do you think from those skills that Meredith just described, what are the key skills that are currently often lacking with managers to really enable them to become a good coach? So let's have a look at that in a second. You mentioned coaching, you mentioned feedback, you mentioned accountability, really making sure that setting the right expectations and that people deliver on those. But I always find interesting coaching and feedback. It's a very close area, and there's some overlap. I also think I recently saw an article where people feel there's a little bit of a more negative connotation with the word feedback, where people love to be coached. Where is that coming from, and what is exactly the difference between coaching and feedback?
Once again, I think really interesting. I'd love to hear from others, but I'll share in our experience a couple of things. One, our definition of coaching is asking questions to have the coachee uncover.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because I actually want to make sure that our viewers at home are actually giving their vote on the poll. So please take that minute to share with us again on that link, because we really want to know what you're thinking. But we also really want to know what you're thinking. So
okay, great.
Feedback and coaching.
Yeah, so coaching, asking open-ended questions so that the coachee is leveraging their own experience and their own connection making to call upon the best answer from their own arsenal, which I think any of us who have ever had a good coach who worked with us, we know that the results of a good coaching conversation provide richer answers and more lasting solutions than someone just telling you what to do. Okay, so coaching. Feedback, which I'm a huge fan of, distinct from coaching, is illuminating for someone something that may or may not be a blind spot. So coaching may not reveal that piece of feedback because it might not be something that we even see about ourselves. And ask any elite athlete, pick your sport. Let's take a gymnast, right? They do run something down the mat and flip and fall on their head. And it really requires at times the coach being bold enough to say, all right, here's what was happening. You dragged your foot, and here's what you did, and here's what you can't do again, and go again. So I think both are really critical. And in terms of the positive versus the negative affiliation with one versus the other, I would say the critical interpretive difference is people really count on the fact that someone who's coaching them has their own best interests in mind, versus when someone's giving feedback, hope and expect that it's always got your own best interests in mind. People don't necessarily know that they can count on that.
And can I say, because actually that last point also has to do a lot with being empathic, because I think that's also very important.
Yes.
As for a coach, is that true, or is that a different skill in itself?
I think being able to appreciate what the other person is going through and looking from their point of view to shape how you respond, for sure, is super important.
That's interesting. And while you're saying, I actually have to think about one framework when I was working back in Google. What we learned, what I found pretty fascinating, was the situational leadership framework. I'm sure you're familiar with it. For the viewers at home, if you haven't heard about the situational leadership framework, I think it's worth looking it up. Basically, it shows that there are also different coaching behaviors depending on the situation. So if your reportee is maybe more competent and more committed on the task that he's being coached on, you might have a more directive or more supportive, empowering coaching behavior. It's hard to really find the right moment for the which coaching behavior, but I think it's a fascinating model as well. Let's actually see from our viewers what they considered to be the key skills that managers often lack to be a good coach. Let's have a look at the results and let's see what we're seeing here. Okay, we see a very clear green, giving and receiving feedback. That's interesting. Would you consider that to be the most important one yourself?
Yes, well, we clearly have at least two in there, right? Both the giving and receiving, and 100%, both. In fact, even giving feedback is such a such a rich area, because giving feedback, you've got incorporated in there giving positive feedback, which many managers don't give enough of, and we know that positive feedback drives behavior change, like, oh, I just got recognized for that, let me do more of that. Many managers haven't had the experience and exposure to know how much of that is really required to develop a high-performance team. Giving constructive or corrective feedback in real time, giving performance breakdown feedback, like, wow, we've really got a problem and let's sit down and partner on how are we going to turn that around. So all those domains of feedback, and then receiving feedback, back to the psychological safety conversation we started with, which is the skill and ability to create an environment of openness where you are getting and incorporating feedback, whether it's cross-functionally from your own manager, or I think most important of all for managers is creating an environment that's safe for upward feedback that you actually are open and receptive to and make actionable.
So I would love to hear later more. We're going to talk about how to train leaders. I'm sure we're going to cover also how to train on the feedback component. There was a research by Gallup which said that 1 out of 10 have it in them what a real leader needs to have in them.
Yes.
Like a natural leadership. Would you agree with that? And how much is there to learn for the other 9 out of the 10?
I would say, based on our experience, 1 out of 10 who has like just that natural it factor sounds probably right. Maybe that even sounds like a lot. But I thoroughly believe and have much experience with that leadership can be cultivated and developed when the conditions are right.
And what's needed for that?
A growth mindset to start, like a person who is really interested in the developing area, that can see that they have areas to develop as a manager, and that they're interested in going to work on those, and even committed to diving into a real growth period to focus on what it takes to grow. So that's the first part, is the growth mindset, a real commitment to that. And then the second is a feedback-rich culture, because we already talked about the performance athlete. If you're not getting the feedback, you can't make the behavior change on the fly. So, you could have like all the openness, like, yay, I really want to grow, but if nobody's telling you how you need to shift, you're not going to be able to do that well.
So growth mindset and a feedback culture. On the growth mindset, and sorry if this is going to get one meta level too high, but that's always fascinated me, because I'm always curious about how much can you learn a growth mindset. To give you an example, I have 3 older brothers, and when we go on vacation, we go to a museum, and there's always one brother who just sticks in the museum to the very end, reads everything which is possibly there, whereas my other brothers and myself, we just want to go to the pizzeria and order a very large margarita. How much can I increase my growth mindset? Can you learn it? Is it?
All right, a few things. Firstly, after about 45 minutes to maybe an hour and a half in the museum max, I'm ready. I'm joining you for the pizza and the margaritas. Thanks. I'll see you there. And I think, I can't recall who the researcher is, but there's a lot of research that shows that in order to optimize brain activity, you need the reset. So nobody wants to be in growth mindset every second of the day. Like,
disconnect.
We all want to disconnect. Exactly. Thank you. Well said. But is growth mindset something learnable? I would say it's not something that has to be learned. I think it's something you choose in any moment. You either say, like, I am how I am, stick a fork in me, I'm not changing, or, you know what, I see that there's like a growth opportunity in front of me, and I'm willing to step into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. How much, because I'm trying to, if I recognize it, how much, I can get really ambitious to learn one topic, but then the other topic, it feels like there's no growth mindset for me on other topics. How much do you think that passion and desire to learn comes into play as well, instead of just forcing yourself?
I think we can take on growth mindset about anything, including things that we're not that passionate about, but certainly the more passionate we are, like the stronger the carrot, and like a carrot and stick idea, the stronger the carrot, like the more appeal or magnetism there is to it, like, oh yes, I really want to learn that. I mean, it makes me think of when I was in college, I started out as a literature major, and I switched my major to neuroimmunology, and that was what I ultimately wrote my thesis on and graduated in. And so I had to take chemistry as, I guess it was a sophomore, and I remember so clearly sitting in the basement of the chemistry building through the middle of the night, trying to understand how a molecule folded in three-dimensional shape and what would be attracted to what would to repel what, and my brain would not do it. And night after night, I kid you not, I can remember it like viscerally in my body, crying in the basement of the chemistry building, like my brain will not do it. And then in one single moment, after many of these nights, I remember it was like, sing, those synapses just connected, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can see it. And it wasn't just for that moment, but it was like from then after it became available that my brain would do that. And I think we all have had that experience where we really just like throw ourselves into wanting to learn something that seems even wildly out of reach. And this is why I go back to that idea of, yes, there are some people who just naturally have leadership capability. And then for the rest of us who are somewhere on the continuum, it depends on how committed and open are you to throwing oneself into that wholeheartedly to grow.
And can I add discipline? I mean, perseverance?
Yes.
Doesn't come automatically.
Totally. There's a lot of tears in that chemistry building.
Once you see it.
Yes, exactly. On the way to learning that.
That's amazing. Actually, about your example, all of a sudden it made sense. I have to think about the famous Dutch soccer player who died last year, Johan Cruyff. And he's well known for very stupid sayings, but when you look at it, you think like, actually, it's brilliant. And one of the sayings is, once it all makes sense once you see it.
Yes.
And I think it also is probably right on that growth mindset experience.
Totally. And that's good, just to tie the pieces back together. That's like, so the 1 out of 10 already sees it. And then the rest of us, it makes sense once we see it. Yeah.
That's fantastic. We talked about the managers as a supportive coach. Now, the question that probably a lot of viewers are waiting for is, how do we train this? How do we train people to become a supportive coach?
Let's see, I think first thing is you have to start with people who have a real desire and appetite to want to learn. I think one of the biggest mistakes that organizations make is they're like, you know what? You are a great individual contributor. You're really producing awesome results. Let's throw you into management or throw you into manager training. And then we all know how that turns out, right? So I think the first thing is to start with a cadre of people who have an appetite to really develop themselves and being sure of that, or as sure as you can be to start. And then the second critical ingredient, once you have that, I think, is an environment of practice and continuous feedback, and starting that ongoing loop of practice, continuous feedback, practice, continuous feedback, practice, continuous feedback. And it happens at different dimensions, because it starts in a manager training, right? Usually in a more, let's call it somewhat formal training environment where you get introduced to a skill. You have the chance to practice it, because almost nobody really learns a skill by hearing about it. So you practice it and get feedback. But then, much more importantly, is outside that manager training, when they go back into their regular work environment, to have an ongoing feedback loop, both bottom up, so hopefully a feedback-rich culture where they're getting upward feedback and have the chance to incorporate that feedback and adjust behavior, and then also top-down feedback from their manager who's observing and coaching them.
And I can imagine there are a lot of young managers also watching today, and they're like, okay, I'm ready to go in, I'm going to try it. And where is the difference between good coaching and micromanaging?
I think you mentioned situational leadership earlier in the conversation, and it's a perfect model to address this question. For anybody who doesn't know it, look it up. But there's no one size fits all. Here's the level of coaching that a person needs. So as a manager, one might have a new person to the team who's richly experienced at a particular task and needs very little oversight, but the manager thinks like, oh, this person's new, let me sit on their head to make sure they're doing it right, which is going to deflate that person and provide poorer results. And on the other hand, you might have a really experienced person who has been in their job at this company doing a great job, but at a particular task is new to that task and needs much more hand-holding and observation. And so I think the pitfall that a manager can make is to think that it's binary, like, oh, this person needs this much coaching from me or this level of coaching, versus I actually have to ratchet it up or ratchet it down depending on the specific task that the person is doing. And ultimately, I think how you can tell whether you're providing the right level of coaching is reading the reactions of the coachee. And that's really an important skill to cultivate. Like, is that person thriving with the degree of coaching I'm giving? Is that really bringing out the best in them? Or is it having them contract and constrict, in which case, let me shift my behavior as a coach?
And when doing that, so when observing the reaction of your reportee and adjusting your coaching style, so we're answering the question, micromanaging or empowering. How do you know if it's purely to do with the amount of micromanagement versus empowering, or it's just the way you do it? So maybe micromanaging can be like the directive style, can be needed, but maybe you have to change your style, and that's why they don't really, like. How do you know if it's because of the empowering versus directive, or it's just another coaching problem you have to work on?
I think one of the things that great managers do is when they're not sure, they ask the person they're managing. So I'm encountering this conflict and I'm not really sure, am I providing too much direction, or is it the way that I'm providing that direction? And then listening, once again, eliciting upward feedback to say, what behavior changes do I need to be making?
And therefore you might need to psychological safety again. And talking about upward feedback, because it seems to be a very important component to really create the right environment. I would love to understand let's throw out add a new poll in the live chat, because we would love to understand from the viewers at home, at your company, how much upward feedback reviews are there happening? Are they happening at all? And maybe in the meantime, before we get to see the results of how many companies of our viewers do those upward feedback reviews, maybe I'd love to share from my experience at Google. Many viewers might have heard of Project Oxygen. As a non-native, I hate that word. Basically, what we did at Google, we had every year an upward leadership review. So there were 8 leadership behaviors, and you had to share with your manager behaviors, how well they were doing. And I think the great thing about this upward leadership review is not only did it create kind of the psychological safety, but have the transparency to share feedback also upward. It helped the managers to see how can they improve. But maybe most importantly, as a company, you really start understanding what are the leadership behaviors from our top performing leaders. And to make it more concrete, I know at Google, they tended to hire always engineering managers with a lot of product knowledge. They thought like engineering managers need to just know everything about technology. And after those upward leadership reviews, they actually figured out that the best performing engineering managers scored high on setting a clear vision and coaching. And so they completely changed around their hiring practices, their training practices, because they understood they needed to make sure that those leaders were actually good coaches and setting a clear vision. So that to me is a fascinating example of another important reason of those upward leadership.
Yes, I very much appreciate Google for providing the actual data behind things that probably anybody who's watching this webinar right now, it's like, oh yeah, managers need to be great coaches. Look, for somebody who really understands and has a lot of observational experience, they're like, yeah, a great manager needs to be a great coach. But Google has done a great job, especially inside their engineering culture, who they want rich data to support those kinds of assertions. It's like, oh no, that's actually statistically now supported that is a critical, in fact, I think the #1 critical skill, right?
Looking at data, let's have a look what the poll results are saying and seeing how many companies actually have upward leadership reviews. So let's go to the results, and what we're seeing that the majority doesn't have
Does not.
upward. No, does not. It's 11 votes on yes and 4 on no. So it's a big majority of not experiencing the upward leadership. So I would say we have another great takeaway from this webinar. Let's introduce the companies to upward leadership. Another thing I want to make sure we cover today, Meredith, is the impact of different communication styles. Because maybe people get a little nervous here, like, oh, I just have such a different communication style. How? Or at our company, there's so many different type of. How does communication style impact leadership and becoming a good coach?
Yeah, well, we all know that some people are motivated and driven by results and focus on control and how much of it they have, and other people are really driven by process and analysis and being able to come to the right answer. So I think it's really an essential skill for a manager to, and for people operations to equip managers and organizations to equip managers with a model, some model, any model for understanding different styles. Whether you like Myers-Briggs, DISC, True Colors, on some level it just doesn't matter, as long as managers are trained in that there are different styles and that each style is equally valid, each style expresses leadership in really positive ways, and that as a manager you need to flex your style to bring out the best in others. And I think is the researcher who was the first one to connect sometime in the last few decades, connected the 4 quadrants of the behavioral DISC model to actually mapped it to the 4 quadrants of the brain to see that each one has a dominant, or each habitual style is connected to one primary quadrant of the brain. So it's not like, oh, I just am a particular style. No, we all have access to all of them, 4 quadrants of the brain. And so as a manager, it's really about cultivating, ratchet down our own kind of automatic overuse behaviors and ratchet up those underuse behaviors in order to bring out the best in others and ourselves.
Yeah, I remember I practiced the DISC assessment myself, and what I loved about it is the very practical tips, not only how you can become a good manager, but also how your manager can become valuable for you. And I remember for me it says, for example, make sure that Wiebe can share his ideas, because he just wants to share his ideas. But that's valuable. If you as a manager know, okay, let him go, let him talk a bit, because this is where he thrives. He just needs to share his ideas. And I think every personality has a little bit of a different how to manage someone in the most optimal way.
Yes, and luckily you had the kind of manager who understood that, took that feedback, and made it actionable.
Yeah, very possible. How do companies identify in their organization the new leaders? Like, who have the capabilities to build that growth mindset and get there?
Well, people are doing it in a lot of different ways right now to greater or lesser effectiveness. But back to this idea of having embedded upward feedback mechanisms, I think having a feedback-rich culture is the most effective way to identify that. It's certainly not in an annual process. I think we all know that those kinds of annual ranking processes without more continuous feedback are kind of an antiquated model, but rich upward feedback where direct reports are able to share their observations, and those are taken into account. And then also, not only the bottom up, but also top down, where performance evaluation for managers looks not only at their direct reports, individual performance, but even if that person isn't already a manager, evaluating that person on their level of skill and ability, bringing out leaders around them, like elevating other leaders around them, and that person's ability to bring out the best in the people that they're working with. If those get isolated, even in top-down performance reviews, along with the bottom-up feedback, those two things really help you identify who those individuals are. And then, not to beat a dead horse here, but you have to then find out, are those people interested in growing themselves versus just being the net sum quantity that they're starting at? Because I wouldn't elevate someone to leadership, or even just a frontline manager who doesn't have an appetite for growing.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we're ending almost this webinar already, and to make it a very practical end here as well, like, what will be your kind of key takeaway? What would you recommend people to take home and as a next step?
I think think the biggest things are, and they've come up a bunch of times in this conversation, so forgive me for repeating myself, but the biggest things that come to mind are growth mindset and making sure that the pool of managers that you're working with has that, and that they understand what a commitment it is to take on growing oneself at whatever level of leadership they're at, whether that's the senior most leadership or the most junior. In fact, in all the manager training programs we've ever rolled out, far and away the most successful rollouts start with those leaders and then working in concentric rings outward, because people, as we know, follow the leader's behavior, right? And secondly, I think you have to have, in keeping with that, you have to have manager involvement in the development of the new managers that you want to grow. If you try to divorce those things and make people operations or learning and development the greenhouse inside of which you're growing managers, you then take these beautiful young plants and put them back in the work environment, and their own manager is, that's going to be the ecosystem inside of which that person is ultimately going to grow or wither as a manager, and they're going to follow that behavior. So once again, that's why I think it's so critical to start at the senior most level working on manager skills and working outward, because you have to have someone's, if I'm a developing manager, my own manager needs to be invested in my growth and focused on giving me that continuous feedback.
It's interesting you bring that up, because we always see the same with Impraise. So we help to build a feedback and recognition culture at companies, and the most powerful thing companies can do is to start with the top leadership and upward leadership review again, because they show, like, they lead by example by sharing their vulnerability and saying, you gave me this feedback, this is what we're going to do about it, and we would love you to do the same. I think that's very interesting to see that.
I have two other thoughts if you want me to share.
Please do.
We need to wrap up. There are two companies that I think do a really great job embedding leadership development and manager training, and it's because of this factor of continuous feedback. One is DigitalOcean. We have nothing to do with this. We can take zero credit for
Around
this.
the corner here.
Oh,
no, we should not say the location.
DigitalOcean has hired an internal coach, and that internal coach, it works with and is available to the managers throughout the organization, so that managers are both getting continuous feedback and behavioral feedback from their manager, but also from a coach mentor who can just work with them on, practicing their skills. Like if you think about when you're learning to play piano, it's not just let me practice the whole concerto, but let me practice this one part that's really hard for my fingers and get feedback on how I did, and then work on that behavior change and incorporate that. So I think DigitalOcean does an amazing job at that, and something to be modeled by other companies. And another company that I think does something really interesting is a woman who I love, respect, and admire, Amy Peck. She really was central in building the culture at SoulCycle. She's a senior person running a huge part of the organization, and she would go out to the studios all around the country and work shoulder to shoulder, spraying stinky shoes, checking people in, so that observationally, the studio managers in all of these disparate locations had the chance both to observe her in action and for her to give one-on-one coaching out in the field to those individuals.
That's amazing. Actually, I do have one more very challenging question, because you brought something up that, and we have 2 minutes, so you brought something up that actually, when we talk with our clients with Impraise, it often comes up as a really big challenge. You mentioned at DigitalOcean, they bring in external coaches to help them. And one really big challenge for an internal coach, or a manager, is that there's always this combination that you need. On the one hand, you want to develop someone, you want to make people better. On the other hand, you need to evaluate them. You need to, you're in the end a key decision maker on their compensation. What's the best way to avoid or build enough trust that although that manager has to make the decision on compensation, there is this real environment for learning and to sincerely helping to develop someone?
Well, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, so you tell me if I don't, but I once again think of a sports analogy, sorry to overuse them, but if you look at the Super Bowl, right, and the teams that make it, the coach of the winning team nurtured and cultivated the talent inside that team over a long period of time, and the people on the team made themselves coachable and let that person provide the feedback and illuminate the blind spots. But at the end of the day, when it's game time, they expect that person to say, you're on the bench, you're in, you run this play. And it is two different hats that that coach has to be able to wear and shift back and forth to make the hard calls, to do what's not only going to grow and develop an individual, but also to shift their hat and say, and now I need to make decisions for what's the best in the team.
Yeah. Well, this was also definitely game time. Thank you so much, Meredith. I think it was a very, very great conversation. And thanks again for having me here. I hope also all the viewers at home really enjoyed this webinar about leadership. We're going to make sure to follow up with some follow-up information, some interesting documents that for really practical tips. Also, feel absolutely free to reach out directly to us for any consult. Maybe for bringing leadership development training to your organization. Meredith at think-human.com. Or if you want to understand better how a technology like Impraise can help your organization, feel free to send me an email at Wiebe, that's W-I-B-E, at impraise.com. And with that, I want to wish everyone a lovely rest of the day. And see you next time. Thank you.